the richest people in human history. In the modern day, the position of world's richest person fluctuates pretty often, and these fluctuations are typically based off of stock price and other economic factors. And while it's interesting to talk about who the richest person in the modern day is, if you have an inquisitive mind, these thoughts may bring you to the question of who was the richest person in other time periods, and who was the richest person in human history. In this video, we're going to answer both of these questions and more, starting at the very beginning of human civilization, the Stone Age. It may serve as no surprise that because the Stone Age is, well, for the most part, prehistoric, we don't have any verifiable sources of wealthy individuals. That being said, that doesn't mean that we don't know what wealth looked like in the Stone Age, and for that reason, I wanted to at least quickly mention it. As I've mentioned in a few of our previous time period videos, wealth in the Stone Age was measured strictly in your ability to survive. And the things that granted your survival in the Stone Age were food, shelter, water, and community. And while those things may have no monetary value, in the Stone Age, being alive is a lot better than being dead with a pile of money. If you were rich in the Stone Age, you had a strong tribe around you. Your group consisted of strong, successful, ferocious hunters, attentive and expert gatherers, and passionate mothers taking care of the young. Humans in the Stone Age needed each other to survive, mainly because every aspect of life was work, and you can't do everything all by yourself. But in a tribe, tasks can be done by multiple people, allowing the group to survive. But outside of just tasks, the group also provided protection from natural predators, because in the Stone Age, humans weren't at the top of the food chain, and there was very much so natural predators that were wanting to eat you. But of course, community isn't the only thing that gave you wealth. Besides having this strong, tight-knit tribe, you also ensure that your tribe is located in a fruitful area of land. And what I mean by this is that hunting is bountiful. Animals consistently graze near your tribe, making hunting easy and consistent. But beyond just having a good location with consistent food and pelts, it's important that you have access to water, which is why you and your very wealthy tribe also have a perfectly clean stream going right beside your tribe's location. This stream provides your tribe not only with water, but also fish and transportation. But even with all of these Stone Age luxuries, there is still one more way that your tribe could have more wealth, and that is by having the best shelter possible. And in the Stone Age, one of the best options was a natural formation, typically a cave that provided shelter from storms and hot weather, consistent moderate temperatures, and once again, protection from natural predators. And while the bar may seem relatively low for the Stone Age, everything I just described was literally a dream come true. And if you happen to have all of these in your life, you were by far the wealthiest person to live. And by wealthiest, I just mean you were alive, because poverty in the Stone Age was literally just death. So even though our caveman ancestors didn't have much, and we can't verify who was the richest person at the time, it's at least interesting to understand what made a wealthy life during this time period, and it's also a good reminder that life is a blessing. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James, the Bronze Age, the time period that comes after the Stone Age. And luckily for us, we have verifiable evidence of who the richest person was during this time period. Wealth in the Bronze Age already looks worlds different than it did in the Stone Age. And that's because during the Bronze Age, human societal development really hit an exponential curve. And while the Stone Age literally went on for millions of years and only really yielded rudimentary structures and stone tools, the Bronze Age is where we really see society develop into small villages and also forging with metals. Most notably in this time period, bronze. With the development of society, culture, and tools, we now have a new definition of wealth. And fortunately, we also have documented history. However, I am using that term lightly because although we do have some texts referring to the reign and wealth of King Solomon, many of them came many years after his lifetime. So take some of these testimonies with a grain of salt. The year is 970 BC, and the Kingdom of Israel is now under new management. King Solomon was the successor to his father, King David. It's estimated that King Solomon's rule ran from 970 BC to 931 BC. An impressive 39 years. And keep in mind, during this time period, even living to see 39 was an accomplishment. But longevity is not the point of this video, and what's even more impressive than his reign was his wealth. It's recorded that under the reign of King Solomon, his kingdom actually earned its highest splendor and wealth of all time, with record revenues reaching 666 talents of gold in a single year, which is an ironic number, but that equates to over 18,125 kilograms of gold earned in a single year. Keep in mind, the reason we're talking in precious metal volumes and not, well, dollar values is because during this time, money didn't even exist, not even any form of coinage. Precious metals were truly the only store of value, meaning that gold was truly the gold standard. And for that reason, King Solomon got a lot of it. And how he got this gold may not be so much of a shock. As the king of a nation, Solomon's wealth primarily came through tax revenue. But on top of this massive tax revenue, he also earned money through trade alliances and also control over important trade routes that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe together. But like any good business mogul, he didn't end there. Solomon was also involved in mining, agriculture, and also building projects funded by the kingdom's resources itself, meaning that not only did he have a massive personal net worth, but he also had, well, basically infinite money at his expense through the wealth of the nation that he managed. And because of the prosperity that Solomon's kingdom saw during his long reign, it's estimated that King Solomon's net worth would be valued at anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion, which is insane. And since it's kind of variable, let's just average it at 2.5 trillion. Now, like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the information available about Solomon came from the Bible, which isn't an issue until you realize that Solomon lived and died hundreds of years before the Bible took place, essentially. So once again, for that reason, take this one with a grain of salt, but it's definitely an interesting first entry. And while we're on the topic of the Bible and interesting, not only did the Bible mention how wealthy King Solomon was, but they also mentioned how, well, promiscuous he was. And it's literally stated in the Bible that King Solomon had over 700 wives, and because that wasn't enough, he also had an additional 300 concubines, meaning that this dude literally not only had trillions of dollars, but also had 1,000 girls in his roster. The Iron Age. Interestingly, the Iron Age is not much different than the Bronze Age, and the brief period transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, society essentially took 2 steps forward in the Bronze Age, and then 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again into the Iron Age. And while once humanity sort of stabilized again within the Iron Age, it didn't look too different from the Bronze Age besides one key difference: the main metal at play, obviously being iron. But beyond the introduction of iron, we also see refinements and growth within the civilizations that were formed in the Bronze Age, or at least the ones that survived it. Consider that subtle foreshadowing. Now, once again, one of the richest people to ever exist, and most likely one of the richest people in all of the Iron Age, was a man known as King Croesus. And Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom that existed in modern-day Turkey. Croesus had a relatively short reign, only reigning from 560 BC to 546 BC, roughly 14 years. But during this time, Croesus became an icon of wealth. And he was so rich, in fact, that the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," actually not only gained steam during his reign, but also existed for millennia after his death. But the story of Croesus and Lydia isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because although he did have immense wealth, his reign and life did eventually end up being cut short. But before we describe that, how exactly did he earn all this wealth? As a king, it may come as no surprise that Croesus's wealth was primarily earned through taxation, trade routes, and natural resources within the Kingdom of Lydia. Interestingly, in the Kingdom of Lydia, there was literally a river that was full of something known as electrum, which was essentially a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold, which is pretty fortunate. But not only was Croesus known for being rich, but he also changed money forever. He actually started minting some of the world's first coins ever, standardizing the world's first gold and silver coins. And he did this so he could A, centralize his wealth, and B, strengthen the economy of his entire kingdom. And his idea of forming precious metal coins took off and spread across, eventually, the entire world. But as I mentioned, the story of Croesus is one of large wealth, but also one of large hubris. And it's claimed in ancient texts that it was the hubris of Croesus that led to his and his kingdom's eventual downfall. During Croesus's peak, the kingdom of Lydia was rich, expanding, and even had alliances with Greek city-states. And Croesus himself was synonymous with wealth and power. And it's believed that because of all of this success and power, Croesus got a bit too confident, and this confidence caused him to challenge Cyrus the Great of Persia, Persia being another opposing empire at the time. Croesus felt confident that he could expand his empire and take on Persia, but first he made sure to contact an oracle, and it's written that this oracle that Croesus consulted prophesied that, quote, Croesus would destroy a great empire. And it's believed that Croesus interpreted this message as he had already won the war, so he could begin it and win with ease. Although the opposite was true, and the empire that Croesus would destroy was actually his own. And in 546 BC, Lydia fell to Persia, and it's believed that Croesus was either executed or spared and turned into an advisor for Cyrus. At the peak of his net worth, it's estimated that Croesus had roughly a net worth of $500 billion. Which, I mean, compared to the previous trillionaire, doesn't sound that much, but this net worth is still insanely impressive. And remember, like King Solomon, this wealth was not stored in cash, stocks, crypto. This money was in physical gold and silver. And dude had so much money and so much time that he literally decided to create coinage. I bet King Solomon would have created coinage too if he wasn't messing around with 1,000 women, the classical era. The classical era is where things begin to get really interesting because history is getting more and more documented and wealth is becoming more and more, well, common. That being said, when I had to choose one rich person to represent the classical era, the option was obvious, and it started with me thinking about one of the most iconic empires that existed during the classical era, that being the Roman Empire. And when you think of Roman Empire, who do you think of? Julius Caesar wouldn't have been a wrong answer, but believe it or not, Julius Caesar wasn't actually the richest Roman. However, who is regarded as one of the richest, if not the richest Roman, was his adopted son, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was getting that bag. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC, and after winning probably the biggest lottery in all of human history, he was adopted by Julius Caesar, the infamous dictator of Rome at the time. Augustus was brought up surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and strategy, and truly learned the ropes from one of the most iconic people to ever live. That being said, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was a massive power vacuum, and Augustus had some major shoes to fill. However, he did exactly that. And not only did he rise to power through political skill, but he also formed strategic alliances and had numerous military victories under his belt. And because of this, at the relatively young age of only 36, Augustus Caesar actually officially formed the Roman Empire. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that we've talked about the Roman Empire at length through our almost 100 videos. And ironically, my second video ever was actually a video about why the Roman Empire fell. And while that's outside the scope of the video, I thought I would mention it, because the Roman Empire has way more lore than I can summarize right now. Let's focus back in on Augustus. Following suit with other kings and leaders we've discussed so far, Augustus accumulated his massive wealth through the major expansion of the Roman territory, massive conquests, and the spoils of war. On top of this, having one of the strongest empires allowed him to have a steady stream of taxation, provincial revenues, and even tributes from conquered land. And conquer land he did. Augustus' fortune was tied to the control of land across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which obviously just was the Roman Empire, but it's crazy to think the sheer scale of this entire place that he controlled. And interestingly, historians estimate that in today's money, the net worth of Augustus would be in the trillions of dollars, likely in the 3 to 4 trillion range. But this is largely because as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he essentially controlled and owned everything within it. Like, just imagine you're working at an Amazon warehouse and Jeff Bezos walks in and just starts taking stuff off the shelves. I mean, nobody's gonna stop him, and technically it's his, but at the same time, it's also the company's, and the lines really start to get blurred. Regardless, Augustus Caesar had an insane career, both politically and economically. And for that reason, he's not only remembered as the founder of the Roman Empire, the son of Julius Caesar, but also as one of the richest men to ever live, with a net worth of, let's say, $3 trillion. The medieval era. History is really heating up with the medieval era, and we are once again getting more and more interesting entries to this list and more data to verify some of these claims. That being said, we are still in the realm of estimation. Although in the medieval era, we have some very interesting estimates to discuss. And I want to start our medieval journey not in medieval Europe, but actually in the steppes of Mongolia. In the year 1162, a young boy named Temujin was born, and little did his family know, Temujin would become one of the most famous and prolific people to ever live. And while this boy was named Temujin, you likely know him better as Genghis Khan. The same Genghis Khan that founded the Mongol Empire, which was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And the wealth of Genghis Khan is actually quite different from the others we've discussed so far, and the others that we're going to discuss as well. Quite frankly, being the founder and ruler of one of the largest empires to ever exist, there is a very likely chance that Genghis Khan could have been the richest person in all of human history. However, there's a very important asterisk on that point. Genghis Khan was not one for personal wealth. And while the empire he was the sole heir to was extremely prosperous and rich in both land, resources, livestock, food, and army, Genghis himself did not store much value. He rather decided to invest back into the army to continue the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which is likely a major contributing factor why the Mongolian Empire was so unstoppable for so long. Genghis ate, slept, lived, and dressed like a majority of his army. And while the actions done by Genghis Khan are, for the most part, deplorable, and the majority of his entire empire was funded by the pillaging and destruction of any other civilization they could, find essentially, it is still somewhat noble that Genghis decided to remain close to his modest roots and invest the wealth that his empire brought him back into his empire to further expand it it. And while estimates for Genghis Khan's net worth range from anywhere from a few trillion to over 100 trillion, I would say that Genghis Khan's net worth is almost negligible considering how he viewed money. But because we need a number on this list, let's just call it 100 trillion in access, but maybe 100 billion in execution. You know, money he actually spent on his own personal lifestyle. And honestly, I think even that's a bit overinflated. The Mongolian people were extremely nomadic, meaning that storing wealth was not necessarily a convenient thing to do. And unless you're Steve from Minecraft, you probably can't store $100 trillion worth of gold in your back pocket. Since Genghis Khan was relatively a modest individual, even though he was likely one of the most powerful people to ever live, I wanted to add a secondary entry for the medieval era, someone you'll likely recognize if you're familiar with ancient, wealthy people. This next individual is a man known as Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, in many regards, is considered to be the most wealthy person to ever exist ever. Full stop. And while there's definitely an argument to back up that claim, we'll discuss how accurate that is at the end of the video. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from roughly 1312 AD to 1337 AD. And under the power of Mansa Musa, Mali was able to reach its peak power, influence, and wealth, controlling almost every key trade route across West Africa. But more notably, Musa's wealth came from the control of trade of salt and gold, which were extremely prevalent in West Africa at the time. But he didn't just profit off the trade of salt and gold. He also profited off the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, and other goods. Or should I say bads, because I don't think calling slaves goods is, well, good. He profited off goods and bads, okay? Regardless, Musa's net worth was immense, and it only grew when he took his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was this pilgrimage that not only grew his net worth, but also increased his international fame. Musa traveled with a massive 60,000 person entourage, and he did so because he needed many people to carry all of the gold that he was earning and traveling with. And because he was traveling with so much gold, he would actually just give it away at different cities he was stopping in. And because of this, in cities like Cairo in Egypt, the gold that Musa was just giving away for free actually disrupted local economies. But yeah, Musa was literally kitted out in full gold armor, all gold tools, had an army of 60,000 people in all gold armor, an additional 60,000 camels with all gold armor, an inventory full of gold blocks. This guy made Mr. T's neck look naked, but at least he was generous. So generous, in fact, that he literally caused inflation. But here's where things get interesting. While every number we've discussed is an estimate, the estimate for Mansa Musa is relatively modest, with a net worth believed to be roughly around $400 billion, which is still massive and more money than the richest person in 2025 has. Although it's nowhere near the trillions we've discussed before. And after doing some research, I almost feel like Mansa Musa is known as the richest person to ever live simply because he was talked about so much in ancient texts, because this guy was just a G. If you saw a dude in all gold with 60,000 other gold people just giving out gold, I would probably believe that was the richest guy ever too. But that's not to discredit his legacy. The early modern era. Once again, there's so many good entries for this time period, we're doing a double feature. And we're starting with a man named Jacob Fugger. And Jacob Fugger is a real Fugger indeed. And that's because this man got so rich that he actually had more power over the kings in Europe. And that is saying something. Jacob Fugger was born into a wealthy family and started his career in the textile industry that his family was deeply invested in. Although it didn't take time for Jacob to realize that there was higher leverage opportunities out there. And he shifted his focus from being a merchant to being a bank for merchants. And with that, he made a massive fortune. And with that fortune, he got into some very interesting situations, specifically funding politicians to have power in parliament, and also by expanding his mining operation to create essentially a monopoly over the copper market in Europe. Jacob Fugger had so much money that he was literally known as Jacob Fugger the Rich. But he wasn't only known as a businessman. Like I mentioned, his career in politics made him known as a kingmaker, because he was giving out massive loans to Maximilian I and Charles V, both of which who ended up becoming massively powerful people within Europe. But Fugger wasn't only funding kings, he literally financed the creation of the Vatican. And to bankroll the construction of the Vatican, he actually started minting his own coins known as papal coins. And it was actually with Fugger's involvement with the Vatican that led to the eventual sale of indulgences, which was literally a ticket to heaven, which eventually sparked the entire Protestant Reformation. Regardless, Jacob Fugger was a very rich man. From textiles to mining to banker, Fugger did it all. And while he didn't do it all ethically, he did it. And it's estimated that his personal net worth was roughly 2% of Europe's GDP at the time, which would equate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. And interestingly, Jacob Fugger's net worth is one of the most provable net worths we've discussed so far, considering there are many records to validate these claims that are publicly available and, well, still exist. So even though 400 billion doesn't sound super impressive at this point in time, the power that he held as a non-royal was insane. And his net worth is likely one of the most accurate and non-inflated we've discussed so far. But like I mentioned, we got a double feature, so let's get that Fugger out of the way and discuss Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great was the third emperor of the Mughal Empire in India, and he ruled this empire from 1556 until his death in 1605. Interestingly, Akbar gained access to the throne at only 13 years old, when his father tragically died. And while giving a 13-year-old reign over an entire empire sounds like a horrible idea and has been proven to be multiple times throughout history, for Akbar, it actually worked out. It's almost like being a child actor. In most cases, it works out horribly, but sometimes it actually kind of does work out. His reign is remembered for vast land expansion, the flourishing of Indian culture, and strong central governance, which was largely missing at the time. And it was these primary contributing factors that made the Mughal Empire one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the early modern era. The wealth that Akbar generated for the Mughal Empire was actually primarily driven by agriculture, as the lands of northern India were extremely fertile. But of course, in addition to this agriculture, he also made most of his money from taxation, both taxing those crops and other goods. On top of agriculture and taxation, once again, control of trade routes was a steady stream of income that allowed the Mughal Empire to grow and flourish. And due to this political success and economic growth, he ended up making the empire extremely rich, like 25% of the entire world's GDP rich, which equates to roughly $30 trillion in today's money. And unlike Genghis Khan, Akbar knew how to spend some money. He was known for his opulence, and so were his courtrooms and official government buildings. I wanted to add these two examples specifically for the early modern era because the examples are so vastly different, both in how they started their lives, acquired their wealth, and obviously the shocking difference in net worth between these two individuals. But keep in mind, for Akbar specifically, this 25% of global GDP is the wealth of the empire he controlled, not his personal wealth. And while that line was relatively blurred, even if we say he conservatively only paid himself 10% of that, we can estimate that his personal net worth was roughly around 3 trillion, although he had access to up to 30 trillion. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it to the time period that we are currently existing in. With that being said, the modern era is considered to be from 1800 to today, meaning that we have a lot of ground to cover and many notable and documented individuals to discuss. So for that reason, I'm going to make this last time period a bit of a speed round. I want to first discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who lived from 1794 to 1877, and he was a man who was known as the first American business tycoon. And that he was. Vanderbilt built his fortune primarily through shipping routes and railroads, and he started his career as a ferry operator in the New York City harbor, where he was first exposed to commercial transportation, which later inspired him to start his focus on railroads and expansion across all of America. That being said, Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a good guy, and he actually earned the name of robber baron as well, because he would typically use monopolistic strategies and market manipulation in his favor to buy railroads as cheaply as possible and extract the most value out of them. Regardless, Vanderbilt is known as one of the men that built America as we know it today, and the railroad systems that he established connecting U.S. cities and boosting American trade are still marveled at to this very day. At the time of his death, Vanderbilt's net worth was roughly $3 billion in today's money. And interestingly, when he died, he was worth more than the US Treasury. So even though $3 billion sounds puny in the video, within context, that number is massive. Cornelius died in 1877, and interestingly, in 1973, only 100 years later, it was found out that during a family reunion, there was not one single millionaire left in the family. That's right, the Vanderbilt family literally blew billions of dollars in less than 100 years through financial mismanagement and I'm sure other reasons. And besides Cornelius, another major player during the beginning of the modern era was a man known as John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, he did. Rockefeller was one of the most prolific industrialists in American history, and he was the founder of the Standard Oil Company during the Industrial Revolution, a time when oil was an emerging market. And he was not only capitalizing on it, he was monopolizing on it. I think it's also important to note that during this time, business was nowhere near what it's like today. Like if you're complaining about modern day capitalism, then you should have seen 1800s capitalism. There was absolutely no regard for the environment, other business people, families, children, nothing. The Industrial Revolution was full of factories that had pregnant women and children working all day, with reckless disposal of industrial waste, and the most strong-arm, backstabby business tactics you've literally ever heard of. 1800s Industrial Revolution business was not for the faint of heart. And fortunately for Rockefeller, this was a game he was willing to play. When Rockefeller launched Standard Oil in 18 1870, he grew the company rapidly by essentially undercutting all of his competition. And then with the revenue he gained through undercutting this competition, he then bought out all of his competitors. And only 2 years after starting Standard Oil in 1872, there was a small few-month streak where Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 oil refineries in Cleveland alone. And this purchasing streak was so impactful on Cleveland that it was literally known as the Cleveland Massacre. But Rockefeller didn't just undercut and buy every oil refinery he could. He also made sure to integrate vertically, controlling everything from the production, transportation, and sales of any oil product. And during the late 1870s, Standard Oil was literally refining over 90% of America's oil. And eventually, people were fed up with it. And I think in some cases, Rockefeller was truly seen as the first real example of true corporate greed, a symbol and theme that would continue until, well, today. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, got so big, in fact, that in 1911, the Supreme Court forced him to break up his company into 34 smaller companies, which he did, and ironically, this division only led to an increase of net worth for Rockefeller. Rockefeller was not a good guy, but there are a lot of things we use every single day that have been influenced from his work, and it was people like him that built the society we live in today, whether you like it or not. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated to be equivalent to almost 2% of all of the US's GDP, and he's also considered to be the world's first billionaire. And while there's definitely other honorable mentions from the beginning part of the modern era, like the Rothschilds and Henry Ford, I want to fast forward to the modern day to discuss some of the richest people in 2025, and also reflect on all of the rich people we've discussed and determine who's the richest of all. As of today, the world's richest man is largely believed to be Elon Musk. But besides Elon Musk, some other notable billionaires include Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and Bernard Arnault. And while I think most of us understand who these people are and how they made their money, I think it's important to reflect on how their net worths differ from people in the past. For example, you don't see Elon Musk storing all of his net worth in gold or taking a 60,000 person pilgrimage across Africa with gold armor on. A majority of his wealth is in shares, stocks, and is largely based off of the evaluation of the companies that he owns. Now, if we stack up Elon Musk's net worth of roughly $382 billion at the time of recording this video, he actually ranks relatively low in the context of this list. And for that reason, this video is about to get rather subjective, because to answer the question of who's the richest person in human history, there's a few different answers, at least in my opinion. If you want to base the ranking of history's richest person based off the numerical value, which, I mean, is logical, then I would say that honestly, Genghis Khan has an extremely strong case for richest person ever. Although, if you want to base it off popular vote, there is a lot of people, for good reason, that believe that Mansa Musa was the richest person to ever walk this earth. However, if you're asking me who the richest person in all of human history is, genuinely, I would say that there has to be more factors beyond just wealth we consider. Because while Genghis Khan may have potentially had the most access to wealth, he personally wasn't extremely wealthy and also lived a lifestyle I have absolutely no interest in. And to be frank, I really don't have much interest in living any time before, I guess, 1990. The reason being, maybe I'm just spoiled, but I enjoy modern luxuries of today. And I would argue that somebody with a minimum wage job in America today lives a much better life than a king did in medieval times. Specifically because the technology, medicine, entertainment, and modern luxuries far outweigh any amount of gold, at least in my opinion. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a castle with a jester and a pile of unlimited gold? Or do you want a toilet that flushes, air conditioning, and access to YouTube to watch Trust Me Bro? That's the question. I'll let you decide in the comments. But if you're asking me who I think the richest person in all of human history is, I would definitely argue that Elon Musk takes the cake. Simply because his net worth is massive, he's the most prosperous man in the most prosperous era of human history, and he's also able to enjoy his money during the best time to ever live in human history, which is today, in my opinion. If you made it this far in the video, obviously you're invested. Leave a comment below letting me know who you think the richest person in history is and why. I gave you my opinion, and I want to remind you, it's just my opinion. It's nothing serious. And in case you're already mad writing a mean comment, just read the name of the channel. Regardless, if you enjoyed this video about the richest people in every time period, I recommend you check out the video on screen right now. It's actually a playlist of all of my in every time period videos. The format of the video you just watched is a format that I actually came up with myself, explaining different topics going through every era of history. So if you enjoyed this video and enjoyed this format, check out the entire playlist of different topics I've discussed in different eras of history. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, trust me, bro.